we've got some time now before we wind up with a short discussion about plans for next year, which I'd like us to have, in reflections on the presentations throughout the day, really. Questions certainly to John and to Janet, who are still with us, and discussion about the themes that have emerged from the various talks we've had. So, over to us, you. Gillian, thank you.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to both our speakers, to all our speakers. I want to particularly address the last speaker, although I would have had questions for all of you. I'm an assistant tutor in the social service users and carers network, but I'm also a stagnant child protection social worker and a child of the welfare state when it's first formed. And I was much struck by your last point, because I was not only a child of that welfare state, but our children were too. And one of the things which was most powerful in a post-war society where large parts of our population being bombed out, where children were travelling from one town to another, one district to another, as the parents had to move because of lack of housing, because parents had failed to return from the war, an impoverished society. And then, again, later on, in a more affluent society, though not without its problems, perhaps in the 1970s with our children, there was a common theme of child protection and child social work experience, where social workers worked in, I would say, an environment centred around clinics, where you would have a school doctor, a school nurse, so paediatricians and nurses skilled in paediatric care, working alongside child care workers, as they were called in those days, psychologists, psychiatrists, educational psychologists, and social workers supporting their teams. If further intervention was needed, they had access to lawyers at County Hall who would also be specialist advisors and take further proceedings where it's necessary. But it gave a very different experience to the local community, because this was a source of reference not just for anxious teachers, but also for anxious parents and families. So you had a much more unified social cohesion and a much safer environment for children. And it seems to me that one of the worst things that happened was in the 1980s, when this was all rapidly dismantled. And it's from that point on that we've had all the scandals about abuse of children. Not because it didn't happen before, it certainly did, partly because of the social norms at the time, but also because they could be much more informally addressed, but very effectively. Because, of course, school doctors had the obligation to medically examine children who caused anxiety, which is quite an interesting reflection in these days when we're worrying about female genital mutilation, for instance, but also where parents or teachers had concerns. And is it that not so much that we expect too much of this nuclear social work, but we have dismantled the ethos in which it operated, and which empowers social workers and other professionals?
Shall I? Thank you. I think that's a really important point. I have to say, and I'd be interested to know what John says as well. I think it's a bit of both, to be honest. I think it's about dismantling that, but I think it's also about what kinds of skills and expertise can you reasonably expect social workers to have within within one programme. So if you take, for example, a French social services team, they will have somebody who's a lawyer who can deal with all the bureaucracy, and I mean, English social work bureaucracy has nothing on the French system. They will also specifically have a psychologist who will be doing work with the child and the parent on psychological issues like separation and loss when a child's being placed, for example. They will also have an educateur who's, for example, in family support, going in doing work around routines and all of those things. I mean, those are all seen as specialist roles in addition to social work. So it's not expecting the social worker to have the most brilliant legal brain to understand all the possibilities in the law, to be doing the direct work of how do you clean up your house, to be doing the work around attachment and loss with the child, to be looking at health needs, making assessments of is this a worrying level of alcohol use or of recreational drug use, what's going on here. It's a huge amount to expect one set of professional knowledge to cover, I think. And I think you need that framework, and as you say, that framework across levels of need, so that social work doesn't just become ever more residualised as the thresholds get pushed up, in order to tackle the needs of families, to achieve that kind of understanding that Isabel talked about. That's my outsider perspective, I think.
I thought I was going to get away with that. I don't know how helpful these two comments are going to be, but I'll say them anyway. After 30 years of working in local government, I have seen how the view that local government has of social work has changed to one where the organisation is more important than the professional group, if I just summarised it like that. And I think in Wales, certainly, and I think also what we've heard today about England is that the profession is working to get that back and to redress that imbalance. And that was some of my point about the damage that people like myself have done. You know, and I'm a social worker, and you know, there's lots of us around. The other is a somewhat cynical view. I don't know how you are whenever you hear that something's gone wrong with a child. It's usually a child. People don't have quite the same reaction if an older person is killed. I'm not quite sure why, but anyway. It's like a countdown to when you'll find out the social services were involved. And then it's another countdown to find out it was all social services' fault. Now, that isn't a complete paranoia on my part, it's an observation. But I think one of the problems is sort of linked to how so much has been put onto social work that you can watch other professions disappearing out of the door the minute anything actually has to be done. And I've actually been in meetings with people, either doing the same sort of thing as me, or trying to get some form of communication between people, where you can see them switching off with a certain relief that they don't have to do it and it wasn't their fault. And we really do, that's a bit of what I was sort of hinting at about the trap we can fall into with ourselves, that we can become quite defensive about that, which will just reinforce their view, or we can become positively assertive about it, which will actually put it back to them about what their responsibilities are. And your point about doctors back in whenever, probably when my father was a public health physician, is very important. You just don't see that now.
I mean, I just wonder whether, just on that, just before we move to other things, whether there are any kind of managers of services in the room who think that that's all a bit bleak. Actually, there is a resurgence of collaborative working, and social workers aren't just abandoned. I'm looking at you, Ellen Jones. And whether any other people, I mean, is there not a more positive spin on what's happening in English social work in a multidisciplinary setting? Did you want to do that?
I think as usual it's a kind of both and answer. I think there are some challenges, but there are also a lot of positives as well. I think some of the work around the kind of team around the family, team around the child, that idea about pulling all the professionals together have been really constructive and positive, and putting the family and child at the heart of that. But I do recognise some of the challenges, and it's when things get really tough. I think that whole kind of perception about what is the statutory function is what is one of the difficulties. Plus, again, the things we need to contend with about how social work is perceived in the wider context we're operating in. So I think there are some positives, and I also think some of the things, the fact that we're all here together today, the fact that we've heard Isabel speak, that resurgence in taking back our kind of professional identity and practice and standing is really important to be celebrated. So I think there is, there's really good things on the horizon, as well as some distinct challenges that we've still got.
But we are taking back our profession, and you're involved in that as well. There is that sense.
I'm principal social worker for children and families. I don't know if Richard is still here. Richard is principal social worker for adults in Brighton and Hove, and both of us have been here today. And I think just the fact that we exist shows that change, really, and that commitment to social work as a profession, and to also practice, to frontline practice. So actually to have a role of a principal social worker with a voice, director to director, linking in with a network of other principal social workers across the country is a really positive development. But yeah, we've still got some challenges there.
No pressures on you, but before Kate, do you want to add to that, or subtract from it, or?
My name is Claire. I'm a practice manager at the duty service over in Whitehall. And just thinking about multi-agency working, we tried the concept of working with other agencies for years and years, really, and trying to bring them on board, and having collective responsibility, and it's, to me, it's about actually building those proper relationships, and really practical professional relationships, because they do make all the difference. And I'll give you a couple of examples. For example, once a week over in our team, we have a paediatrician to come over and talk about cases of sexual abuse and neglect, and that makes a huge difference, because we then have a health perspective on things, and it's a way of pushing things forward. Another thing that we've had in the team, which has been really helpful, has been to have an adult mental health nurse in the team, which is raised the bar hugely in terms of social workers' knowledge around adult mental health. It's really helped with the relationships with the adult mental health service. It's just meant that there's been lots of good collaborative working. So, although it can be difficult with other agencies, I don't think we should give up hope, because I think it's possible, but you do have to work hard at that relationship building.
What about John's point about being ditched at the end? When the crunch comes, it's the social worker who's got the statutory responsibility, and they've all legged it.
Yeah, I think there is still an element of that, but I guess we need to get stronger as a profession about it being a collective responsibility, really.
Can I come back on?
Let's have a discussion, yeah.
Unravel. Okay, thanks. I'm actually, this isn't being defensive now, but I'm actually a great advocate of multidisciplinary working, multi-agency working. I've spent most of my life doing that, so I recognise what you're saying. And in Wales, we have the teams around children. We pride ourselves around the model that you're describing. We have a long history in learning disabilities and mental health of multidisciplinary teams. I managed one for many, many years. What interests me, I think, is the point you made at the end, that you have to keep at it. And the people who are going to really keep at it are probably the social workers and other social care staff, because actually we are probably the ones who recognise that it's very difficult to do our jobs without the others. They take a bit longer to recognise it. When they do, it's brilliant. It is absolutely brilliant. But if you take learning disability services in Wales at the moment, I've lost count of the number of cycles we've gone through where we've recreated the multidisciplinary team, and then community nurses have decided they'll only give injections. Do you recognise that one? And then you work through it, and everybody's caseworkers, and then suddenly they're only giving injections. It's like a cycle we go through with this form of working. I never gave up on it, which is why I took on the joint post. But you've got to be pretty assertive with it. It's really my message.
Okay, John. Yeah.
Okay. My name's Kate Richards. I'm an independent social worker. Hiya, talk louder. I guess I'm really inspired today because what I'm hearing is that maybe the problem isn't with social work, it's with the way we're organised. There was a local authority social worker in child protection not that long ago, and I've got an idea of as well as being a practice educator, I've got an idea around a new type of service for children on child protection plans, for children that are looked after. And my question really, I don't know who to, but anybody can have a go at this, is about the role of independent social work, because I've been trying to develop this idea for the last 6 months with schools, with different partners, and I'm at the point of thinking, would I do this better if I was inside a local authority? Would I be able to get my idea down and out there to children and families more quickly? Or as an independent social worker, is the potential to be more involved in innovative service development? It doesn't feel like that at the moment, but maybe I'm missing something about independent social work, whether there's networks out there, just what the potential is really around that massive group of people who've often got lots of experience.
I mean, I'm quite happy to come back on something on that. I've lost it. They won't hear me internationally, this is terrible.
The machinery is running out of speed.
My once-in-a-decade opportunity to speak across the world.
Briefly, John.
Briefly, yeah.
Briefly.
The first one is I think it depends which authority you worked for, frankly. In some authorities they would bite your hand off, and other ones they would shut you up. The other comment, very briefly, is Isabel's comment about commissioning. There is something about social work actually, can I use the term, selling itself as a service, as opposed to just something that arranges others. And as independent social workers, you can start to actually say, this is what you will get from independent social workers, and start seeing who will take you up on it.
Joan, anything else?
Just a very quick comment about interdisciplinarity and multi-agency, multidisciplinary teams. My experience of doing that kind of work is that what really stands in the way is very different cultures, organisational, institutional, professional cultures. And certainly some of the Sure Start work that I've participated in and seen suggests that it's a very difficult barrier. But training staff together, or giving, for example, social workers some sessions with health visitors, GPs, etc., which the old master of social work used to do, is am I not speaking loud enough? Okay. Is one way of beginning to help different occupational groups to see each other's perspectives. It's not easy. I mean, when social workers heard what GP students were going to be learning in 5 years' time, they really fell off their chairs and they became much less sympathetic to the long hours that GPs work. But I think it is incumbent on trainers, on educators, to find ways of arranging some training in common.
Can I
Go on, yes.
Yeah, I think what I want to kind of come back to, I suppose, the question that Jean and I posed in this, which was really directed at policy, was directed at the people who were working on the social work task force and then people going on to implement that. And I think I absolutely agree with everything you say and what's been said before. But I do think there is a danger in, what Jon says essentially, that this kind of, to work successfully multi-professionally becomes something else that we expect social workers to make happen. And I think this needs to come from top down, and research that I've done over the years on interprofessional working, it always works best and is most secure when it's the directors, when it comes from the top down and the funding is mainstreamed and it's not a 6-month pilot project and show me what your outcomes are, show me how much money you've saved or how many families you've turned around. It's about, and I think that's what's interesting about the European comparison here, is that it's not about, oh well, we've shown that if you have this mix of teams you can spend X number of £1,000 per family. It's about believing that fundamentally this is a task which needs an interdisciplinary understanding and starting from that point.
Were there any other kind of... Yes, Sharon. And then we'll begin to wind up.
Thank you. I'm Sharon Lamley, lecturer here at Sussex. We've talked quite a lot about, obviously, social workers' experiences. We've talked about policy and practice in countries, but what we haven't really talked about, although it's been mentioned by not mentioning it, is about management and leadership, which is my particular area. And it's interesting, Isabel's take on some of the things that need to change, and of course in defending the profession, it's not just social workers that need to defend the profession, managers, many of whom are also social workers. And I just wonder what you see either from European or from your experience as a senior manager in Wales about what's going to happen with social work managers, and will they be getting behind social workers in this if you like, reclaiming of the profession. Do you see that in the studies that you see, or in the places you work?
1 minute each, please.
It's a course in its own right, so you can invite me back. I think middle managers have the biggest challenge because they're caught between a hard place and another hard place, and I think that's difficult. I did hint at it really about the role that people like I had. We implemented policy and we did it in a particular way, and we're having to unpick it, but people are finding that really quite uncomfortable. The other thing you can invite me back for is the culture one, because that's a whole term, that is, culture.
Yeah, I mean, I feel I could give John my minute, because the leadership within child and family services isn't something we've explicitly studied, although we've often interviewed service managers within these studies. And I mean, I think it, if you talk to people in other countries about the challenges of this work and about the principles that guide that leadership, then I think you would hear things that anything I could say would be very familiar to everybody here. The one thing that I would add, just to kind of come back to this point about interprofessionalism, is one of the very clear messages that we've got from managers is that precisely that difficulty that you talked about is seen as a very creative conflict, and that partly ties to social pedagogic theory, which theorizes conflict as being important because conflict is part of disagreement is part of democracy. So if you don't have different ideas, if you don't have different understandings about how to do things, then, and social pedagogy does have its origins in countries like Germany, which have had totalitarian regimes. So those ideas of democracy are very important to its modern incarnations. So I actually think that interprofessional debate is a really healthy thing, and Russell and I bring our BA students together sometimes, which they sometimes find difficult, and I know some of them are here and might agree that that can be challenging, but it's also, I think it's also really productive to start to think about the conflicts that arise when you start to work interprofessionally.
Okay, it's getting towards the end of the time that we're in here, and we do indeed have to go before the next lot come. But before we finish, I just wanted to, if I can, just kind of reflect on one thing that Amir said, and also John following up from that hasn't been mentioned, which is this idea that social work is, and has been at certain historic times, certainly is in Israel now, judging from what John told us, which was quite shocking, wasn't it? That social work has been part of a bigger collective struggle, as well as as well as to do with the individual casework and work that we find more familiar. And I didn't get a sense so much of that from Isabel's speech, and I don't know whether that's the difference between English traditions of social work and Welsh traditions, although I remember the miners' strike too. And we did all contribute then, and that was part of our experience 30 years ago as social workers. And clearly colleagues elsewhere in the world, this is in their face experience, the discrimination against groups of people within society. So I didn't want us to not pick up those themes that came from what Amir and John said in particular, and what Janet has just said now about the experience of social work in Germany before the Second World War is deeply troubling, actually, too, in connection with those wider political debates and struggles. And I do think that World Social Work Day is about that, above all else. It's about reconnecting social work to wider political struggles for social justice.